He forced me out, lied to the bank, and refused to support his kids. But every unfair move he made only fueled a revenge that would cost him everything. Before the story unfolds, hit that like button and subscribe. This tale proves that when someone underestimates you, patience, strategy, and persistence can turn injustice into triumph. The day our first child was born should have been the happiest in my life, but instead it marked the beginning of a nightmare. My ex insisted I quit my job, claiming it was for the family, but really it was about control. At first, I tried to believe his words, thinking he had our best interests at heart, but the truth soon became impossible to ignore. By the time our second child was 2, I discovered his affair, and everything fell apart. The emotional and verbal abuse escalated, occasionally crossing into physical aggression, leaving me anxious and exhausted every day. I remember the terror when he abused our firstborn. It shattered something inside me. That night, I knew I had to act, and I put him out of the house. Despite the fear of what that would mean for our fragile family structure, I had no family nearby, no safety net, and daycare was unaffordable. Every night, I lay awake, heart pounding, thinking about how to keep the kids safe while still making ends meet. The helplessness was suffocating, a constant weight pressing down on my chest. Financial abuse followed swiftly. He refused to provide support, claiming that until the court mandated it, he owed nothing. He even lied to the bank, freezing my accounts when I tried to access money for basic necessities. I felt trapped, cornered, and humiliated in my own life. Filing for divorce meant exposing him, and yet I feared retaliation. The anxiety was relentless, nights stretching endlessly as I worried about my children's safety and well-being. 6 months after kicking him out, the court finally intervened, ordering him to pay $2,562 a month for child and spousal support. Relief should have followed, but it didn't. He refused to pay until garnishment kicked in, leaving me $6,000 behind and still struggling to cover daily expenses. I remember the mixture of fury and exhaustion, every attempt at fairness met with deceit and resistance. I knew I had to be strategic to protect my family and reclaim some sense of control. I remarried a year later, cautiously rebuilding my life. When I checked the court documents, I noticed a small checkbox that had been overlooked: spousal support stopping upon remarriage. It wasn't checked, meaning I could legally keep that year's support without interfering with my rights. I made a conscious choice not to pursue his retirement, instead allowing that year of payments, roughly $12,000, to sit untouched. I thought this was fair, a compromise between justice and pragmatism, until he decided otherwise. Everything seemed calm until 2017. Out of nowhere, he filed for sole custody of the children. Panic and dread surged through me. I had worked so hard to protect them from his abuse, and now he sought control again. He discovered I had remarried and realized he had been paying spousal support during the first year of my new marriage. I remember feeling my stomach twist, heart racing, as I tried to calculate how to protect myself while remaining within legal bounds. When I told him I had taken the spousal support instead of filing for his retirement, he demanded I repay it immediately. The judge ruled I had to, but cleverly structured the repayment to be deducted from increased child support, resulting in a net gain of $20 a month for me. It was a small victory, but it mattered a tiny crack in his perceived control. He dropped his custody claim in exchange for 2 extra weeks with the kids in the summer, showing how fragile and desperate his strategy truly was. The battle over his 401k would drag on for years. He refused to cooperate, trying to delay and frustrate the legal process for 4 long years. Each hearing, each motion filed, tested my patience and resolve. I endured sleepless nights, the fear that legal loopholes could allow him to slip away with his money, and the lingering tension of knowing he continued to manipulate and obstruct justice. Every small delay tightened the knot of anxiety in my chest. The court finally sanctioned him, forcing him to pay $600 a month for a year, in addition to child support. He was also charged with contempt. The tiny victories began stacking. Each legal maneuver, each sanction, a psychological release. I started to feel a thrill, not from cruelty, but from the slow, methodical reclamation of what had been denied to me. The sense of empowerment grew, subtly replacing the fear and helplessness that had dominated my life for years. I remember the morning of January 2021 vividly. He proposed to his girlfriend, blissfully unaware that the culmination of our legal battle was imminent. By May, The disbursement from his 401k finally arrived, 4 times the amount of the spousal support overpayment. I had never anticipated it would be this much, and yet every unfair move he had made, every delay and act of obstruction, had directly contributed to the outcome. I felt a surge of vindication, watching the scales tip decisively in my favor. After years of being manipulated, ignored, and financially sabotaged, I finally felt a spark of control. The legal battles, the endless court dates, the stress it had all been leading to this moment. I realized I could turn his arrogance against him, and for the first time in years, the helplessness lifted. There was a thrill in knowing that he had underestimated me at every turn. The power of patience and strategy became my ally, and I was ready to wield it. I reviewed every document, every court order, and every past payment meticulously. Every detail mattered. Every clause could become leverage. He had failed to check the spousal support box upon my remarriage, a tiny oversight, but one that could yield immense results. I felt a surge of satisfaction as I considered the possibilities. It was a turning point. Finally, the scales could balance, and perhaps even tip decisively in my favor. I spent sleepless nights calculating, strategizing, and imagining every possible scenario. Could I file for the 401k? How would it affect the court's previous orders? I analyzed timelines, payments, and the gaps in his planning. Each possibility opened new avenues of control. The anticipation was intoxicating, a slow, deliberate thrill that replaced months of fear with meticulous purpose. The first step was psychological. I reframed the situation in my mind. I told myself this wasn't greed or vengeance, it was reclaiming what had been denied to me. Every act of delay, every refusal to pay child or spousal support, had consequences he had chosen to ignore. I allowed myself to feel justified anger, the kind that fuels precision rather than rash action. My strategy would be cold, calculated, and undeniable. I consulted with my attorney, carefully outlining my plan to pursue a split of his 401k. I wanted the process airtight, with no room for manipulation. Every precedent, every clause, every timeline was scrutinized to ensure my legal position was unassailable. I felt the adrenaline of preparation, the kind that turns anxiety into confidence. The plan began to feel less like a distant dream and more like an inevitable outcome. Meanwhile, I kept meticulous track of his behavior. Each refusal to cooperate, each delay tactic, was logged. I noticed patterns: his arrogance, his assumption that I would be too exhausted to fight. Every misstep he made became evidence in my mental playbook. The anticipation of watching him face consequences for his own actions became almost tangible. I began visualizing the courtroom, every exchange, every argument. I imagined the judge's reactions, his own defensiveness unraveling, the contempt charges looming. Each scenario reinforced my resolve. I could almost feel the tension, the quiet satisfaction building as I anticipated the moment justice would strike. It wasn't revenge in the petty sense, it was strategy, execution, and moral vindication. Every call with my attorney was a careful rehearsal of arguments and evidence. We discussed timelines prior, payments, and strategies to force compliance. I absorbed each detail, visualizing how it would play out in court. The meticulous attention to every fact and figure became almost addictive, a mental chess game against someone who had underestimated me for years. I reminded myself daily why I was doing this. The years of manipulation, refusal to pay support, and personal attacks had left scars. The sleepless nights caring for 2 children alone, navigating financial ruin, and enduring emotional abuse had shaped my determination. I transformed every pang of frustration into motivation for a strategy that would ensure long-term security and justice. I rehearsed the conversations I would have with him, anticipating his deflection and denial. I knew he would try to paint me as greedy or manipulative. I prepared calm, factual responses for every scenario. Each rehearsal reinforced confidence, preparing me to navigate the inevitable confrontation with calm authority. I was reclaiming my power, step by step, word by word. The legal paperwork became a tool of psychological warfare. Every motion filed, every timeline documented, felt like an arrow aimed squarely at his arrogance. I relished the precision required, the control I now wielded over a man who had once made me feel powerless. The strategy unfolded as much in my mind as in reality. Each step designed to maximize leverage and minimize exposure. I considered the timing carefully. Filing too early or too late could jeopardize the impact. I waited, gathering information, reviewing evidence, and anticipating his responses. The patience was almost torturous, but necessary. Each passing day added weight to my eventual leverage, a slow burn plan that would culminate in undeniable justice. I envisioned the court hearings, imagining every look, gesture, and reaction. His smugness would be met with calm facts and unassailable evidence. I rehearsed each argument mentally, visualizing how it would undermine his authority and expose the years of obstruction and abuse. The mental simulation became almost physically, my chest tightening with anticipation, adrenaline buzzing in my veins. I strengthened my position financially and logistically. Tracking payments, compiling records of arrears, and understanding his assets gave me a clear roadmap. Every detail increased my confidence and my ability to withstand potential challenges. The strategy was no longer theoretical, it had become concrete, tangible, and ready for execution. I prepared for his psychological reactions. I knew he would try intimidation, threats, and manipulation. I fortified my resolve, reminding myself of the years of unfairness and the children's well-being at stake. The thrill of outmaneuvering him mentally grew stronger each day. Every calculated step became a small victory, building momentum toward the ultimate outcome. I reached out to witnesses and professionals to ensure that all my evidence was irrefutable. Each testimony, each document, and each precedent was a piece of the puzzle. The anticipation of presenting a flawless case filled me with a quiet, simmering excitement. It was more than financial revenge, was the vindication of truth, a strategic dismantling of a manipulator's carefully constructed facade. My friends and new family supported me, but I kept the strategy close to my chest. I didn't need anyone's input. This was my plan, my execution, my control. The psychological thrill of knowing they had no idea what was coming added fuel to my determination. I visualized the final confrontation repeatedly, each mental rehearsal sharpening my resolve. I began to anticipate small victories, each court date, each ruling, each sanctioned payment. These milestones became markers of progress, proof that the strategy was working. I felt a growing sense of empowerment, the helplessness of the past replaced by tactical control. The revenge was no longer hypothetical. It was inevitable, and I could almost feel it crystallizing. I imagined the eventual disbursement, the culmination of years of strategy and legal pressure. I didn't dwell on greed. I focused on justice. The thought of finally receiving what was rightfully mine and what had been withheld unfairly for years was exhilarating. Each detail of planning reinforced the inevitability of success, a psychological high that was both satisfying and empowering. I rehearsed the conversation with him once more, preparing for denials, manipulation, and deflection. Calm, factual, precise. I would be the embodiment of control. I envisioned his frustration, his inability to respond effectively, and the subtle, growing realization that he had lost this battle. Anticipation made my pulse quicken. I was ready for the final phase. I cross-referenced every prior payment, every court order, every detail of spousal support and child support. Accuracy was paramount. One overlooked detail could undermine the strategy. The meticulousness became almost meditative, each verification reinforcing confidence and determination. I could see the path to victory clearly, mapped out step by step. I calculated the psychological impact on him, knowing that the revelation of the 401k disbursement would be a shock. He had tried to control every aspect of my life, and yet he had no control over this outcome. Each calculation, each estimate, increased my anticipation of the moment justice would hit. The thrill was both emotional and intellectual, a perfect blend of strategy and vindication. I ensured that every legal motion was timed for maximum effect. I wanted the sanctions, the contempt charges, and the eventual disbursement to hit with undeniable impact. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about precision, fairness, and correcting years of injustice. The strategy unfolded like a symphony, each legal maneuver a note in the composition of final victory. Each night, I rehearsed the eventual confrontation mentally. I envisioned the smugness replaced by frustration, the arrogance replaced by helplessness. Every detail of the plan was in place, every contingency considered. The psychological tension and anticipation were almost unbearable, but in the best way, fueling focus, resolve, and preparation. By the end of 2020, everything was set. The sanctions, contempt charges, and impending disbursement were all aligned. I felt a rare mix of exhaustion and exhilaration, the culmination of years of strategy, patience, and resilience. The stage was set, and the final act was about to unfold, delivering justice and financial vindication in a way that was as satisfying as it was inevitable. January 2021 was the calm before the storm, though I could feel the tension coiling in my chest. His engagement announcement had come just weeks before, a casual email to family and friends that didn't even mention the financial obligations he still owed me. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that all the preparation, all the careful planning, had led to this exact moment. The anticipation was almost electric, a mixture of fear, thrill, and satisfaction. By May, the court disbursement finally landed. I opened the notification and froze, my eyes widening as I read the total. It was roughly 4 times the amount of the spousal support overpayment I had initially accepted. I couldn't help but laugh softly, a quiet, victorious sound. Years of delays, manipulations, and deceit had finally resulted in an outcome far beyond what I had imagined. I remembered the sleepless nights, the long legal battles, the fear that he might manipulate the system to avoid paying me. Those memories, once sources of stress, now felt like fuel. Every act of obstruction he had committed had only ensured the final outcome was bigger, more undeniable. I allowed myself a small smile, knowing that patience and strategy had yielded a reward he had never anticipated. The first call from his fiancée came shortly after the She was angry, incredulous, and accusatory, blaming me for stealing his money. I listened calmly, suppressing the thrill of knowing the truth would sting her more than any insult. I reminded her matter-of-factly that he had been given the option, either let me keep the spousal support or contest the 401k. His choice had led to this outcome, she sputtered, arguing that he shouldn't have had to lose anything. I stayed firm, explaining that this was a legal process, one he had obstructed and ignored for years. Every delay, every refusal to pay support, every lie he told had contributed directly to the size of the final I felt a quiet, satisfying power in speaking the truth calmly, while she floundered in indignation. In the following weeks, the psychological effects on him became evident. His bravado diminished with each bank statement, each confirmation of the I imagined the frustration building behind his carefully constructed facade, the realization that control was no longer his. Every day, I felt a small wave of vindication. A reminder that strategy and patience always beat arrogance and deceit. The legal system itself had become a weapon of psychological leverage. Contempt charges, sanctions, and garnishments had all built pressure over the years, culminating in the final financial impact. I could almost hear his disbelief as the sums were calculated, the weight of his own mismanagement pressing down. There was a meticulous beauty in how every prior act of defiance had backfired, spectacularly. I began to see subtle shifts in his behavior. Calls became tentative, excuses more strained, his usual domineering tone replaced with hesitance. I imagined him sitting alone, reviewing the disbursement, realizing that every attempt to control me had not only failed but had cost him far more than he ever intended. The satisfaction of watching him grapple with the consequences was almost tangible. Friends and colleagues who had witnessed the earlier struggles began commenting on the outcome. Whispers of admiration, surprise, and validation reached me. They recognized the careful orchestration of years of patience and strategy. I felt a mixture of pride and relief, knowing that my story was no longer invisible, that justice was publicly recognized. As the disbursement processed, I finally allowed myself to breathe, feeling the tension unwind slowly. The constant stress of waiting, planning, and defending my rights had been exhausting. Now, the weight lifted, replaced with a sense of accomplishment and relief. The past years of fear and uncertainty now seemed distant, overshadowed by the clarity and fairness of the final outcome. I reflected on the moral clarity of the situation. I hadn't sought revenge for cruelty's sake. I had sought justice. Every decision, every legal maneuver, was rooted in reclaiming what had been unfairly withheld. That moral grounding made the victory feel not just satisfying but righteous. I could smile without guilt, knowing that the outcome was fair, measured, and deserved. Watching him interact with his fiancée after the disbursement was almost surreal. I imagined the awkwardness, the tension, the subtle cracks in his confidence. He had projected control, dominance, and manipulation for years, yet now he faced undeniable consequences. The psychological shift was almost palpable. A man who had underestimated me was learning the limits of his own power. each letter from his attorney confirming compliance, each statement showing deductions and payments, reinforced the sense of justice. I traced the journey from the moment he refused to pay support to this final financial reckoning. It was a long, exhausting road, but the meticulous build-up made the victory even more satisfying. I could finally feel the weight of years lifted from my shoulders. I allowed myself moments of reflection on the children, ensuring their well-being had been my primary concern, and every legal maneuver had also been about securing stability for them. The financial vindication was secondary in importance, yet it symbolized empowerment and protection. Knowing that the children's security was reinforced by the outcome made the triumph deeply personal and emotionally resonant. His attempts to vilify me publicly had no traction. People recognized the truth. He had been given every opportunity to comply fairly, and had chosen delay and obstruction. Each failed attempt to control the narrative reinforced the psychological impact of the outcome. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction in witnessing the unraveling of a carefully constructed facade. I remembered the initial spousal support I had accepted and how small it had seemed at the time. The 401k disbursement dwarfed it, proving the old adage, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Each calculated step over the years had amplified the impact, and I felt a quiet, almost poetic justice in the way things unfolded. Every misstep he made had contributed to the final result. The financial stability gained allowed me to plan for the future. I could save, invest, and continue building a secure life for myself and the children. The sense of empowerment extended beyond vindication. It became tangible security. I realized that the strategic patience and careful legal planning were not just about revenge, they were about reclaiming agency over my life. Even years later, the psychological impact lingered. His frustration, humiliation, and the consequences he faced were constant reminders of the importance of strategy and patience. I could smile quietly knowing that the person who once controlled and manipulated me had no power left. Each memory of past fear and helplessness was transformed into lessons in resilience and calculated action. The story reached its climax, not with dramatic confrontation but with the quiet inevitability of law and preparation. Every call, every letter, every court filing had built momentum, culminating in a disbursement that reflected both legal justice and personal vindication. The satisfaction was profound, almost meditative. As the years of struggle transformed into tangible, undeniable success, I began to see the broader lesson in the experience. Those who underestimate others, manipulate, and refuse to comply with fairness often create their own downfall. Strategy, patience, and moral clarity become powerful tools. I realized that the personal victory was emblematic of a universal truth. Calculated persistence trumps arrogance and deceit every time. As the 401k disbursement finalized, I allowed myself a small celebration, a private acknowledgement of years of resilience. The stress, fear, and uncertainty had finally given way to relief and empowerment. I felt a mixture of pride, satisfaction, and quiet triumph, knowing that the painstaking journey had reached a just and fitting conclusion. The reactions of those around me were subtle but meaningful. Friends, family, and colleagues offered congratulations, validation, and admiration. They recognized the magnitude of patience, strategy, and execution required to achieve such a victory. I felt a sense of community support, a shared recognition of the justice finally served out. In the months following, life stabilized in ways it hadn't for nearly a decade. Financial independence, emotional clarity, and a sense of agency replaced the chaos of the past. The ex's influence diminished, and his attempts to control the narrative or manipulate outcomes faded into irrelevance. I felt a profound sense of closure, the culmination of years of meticulous planning and legal perseverance. Reflecting on the journey, I understood that revenge had been secondary to justice, strategy, and protection. Every sleepless night, every court date, every tiny victory had built toward a larger, undeniable outcome. The satisfaction was both personal and moral, a validation of patience, resilience, and the refusal to accept injustice. The long arc of planning, patience, and execution had paid off completely. Sitting quietly in the aftermath, I felt a profound sense of triumph and release. The ex had lost control, the 401k had been secured, and the years of manipulation had been overturned. Justice had been served, strategy had prevailed, and I could finally breathe, knowing that the consequences he had brought upon himself were a result of his own choices. The final lesson was clear: patience, intelligence, and moral clarity always win in the end.